The barn door stood open just wide enough that I could make out her shape against the moonlight, and before she even turned around I already knew something had gone deeply wrong. She had been my closest friend since we were 5 years old. We had walked the same road to school, milked the same cows side by side, stolen whispered conversations through the long hours of church services. And now she was standing in her father's barn at midnight with both hands pressed flat against her stomach. When she finally turned her face toward me, it was wet. She had been crying for hours. "Martha," she whispered, "I'm late. 3 weeks late." I felt the floor of the world tilt beneath me. I understood exactly what those words meant inside the life we were living. Exactly what machinery they would set into motion, even though neither of us could yet bring ourselves to speak it plainly. Standing there in the smell of hay and horses and cold night air, I grasped in that moment that the girl I had known my entire life was about to be transformed into something else entirely. Because in the Amish community, an unmarried girl who becomes pregnant does not simply have a baby. She becomes a cautionary tale, a whispered name, a warning mothers pass to daughters across generations. I grew up Old Order Amish in Lancaster County and left when I was 24. I carry the stories my community spent decades working to keep buried. This is one of them. Let me explain something that took me years to fully understand. In the world outside, an unplanned pregnancy is a private matter. It moves between a woman, her partner, her doctor, perhaps her family. In the Amish world, there is no such category as private. Your body belongs to the community. Your transgressions belong to the church. Your future belongs to the bishop. And when a girl's belly begins to show before she has spoken vows before the congregation, every one of those forces moves simultaneously, and none of them move gently. Here is what most people looking in from the outside do not understand about premarital pregnancy in Amish communities. It is far more common than any tourist brochure would ever suggest. Bundling, the courtship custom in which unmarried couples lie together in bed, produces precisely the outcome you would expect it to produce. Studies of Amish settlements have documented that rates of premarital pregnancy run significantly higher than in mainstream American culture. This is something everyone within the community knows, and no one openly acknowledges. A very specific system has developed for managing it, and that system was about to close around my best friend like a trap. She was 19. The boy's name was Samuel, 22 years old, the second son of a well-regarded family, and he had been bundling with her for 6 months. She had told me about him in hushed voices at quilting bees, her cheeks flushed, her eyes holding that particular brightness that belongs only to a girl who believes she is loved. She had been certain he was preparing to speak to her father about marriage. She was wrong. When she finally told her mother, 3 days after she told me in the barn, the response was not what you might imagine. Her mother did not raise her voice. She did not weep. She went very, very still. She set down the bowl of green beans she had been snapping, walked to the bedroom, and pulled the door shut behind her. My friend sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours waiting. When her mother finally emerged, her face had been washed and her apron changed, and she said exactly 6 words. "We will speak to the bishop." That was the first stage. In our district, when a pregnancy outside of marriage was suspected, the bishop and 2 ministers would come to the family home. They would be seated in the front room. The girl would be summoned. She would be required to confess aloud, in explicit detail, to 3 men she had known since childhood. Men who had baptized her. Men who had watched her grow from an infant. Men who would now determine what became of her. She described that meeting to me afterward, and her hands trembled the entire time she spoke. They asked her who the father was. They asked her how many times. They asked whether she had participated willingly. She was required to answer every question. There was no lawyer present, no advocate, no mother permitted inside the room. Only her and 3 bearded men, and the full accumulated weight of the community pressing down from above. Now, here is where the machinery of this system reveals its true nature. After the confession comes the consequence, and in our community, the consequence has a precise name. It is called the ban, and it is a form of temporary excommunication. She was placed under the ban for 6 weeks. During that period, she was forbidden from eating at the same table as her own family. She sat at a small separate table in the corner of the kitchen while her parents and brothers and sisters ate their meals together. Nothing could be handed to her directly by another member of the community. If her mother brought her a plate, the plate had to be set on the counter first, and she would collect it herself afterward. She could not attend church services. She could not spend time with other young people. She could not be seen publicly in the company of anyone outside her immediate household. The purpose of all this, the bishop explained to her, was to bring her to genuine repentance, to let her feel in her body the weight of separation from everything she belonged to, so that once she was restored, she would never stray again. She described those 6 weeks to me as the most isolated period of her life. She said she would lie in her bed at night listening to her family's voices drifting in from the kitchen, their conversation and occasional laughter, and she felt like a ghost drifting through her own home. But the ban was only the opening chapter. The consequence that would actually shape the rest of her life came after. Samuel, the father, was also placed under the ban. He was required to make his own confession. He served his own 6 weeks of separation. But here is the piece that broke something inside me when I watched it unfold. The pressure the community directed at Samuel was of an entirely different character than the pressure directed at her. He was expected to marry her, and quickly, within weeks. There was no conversation about whether either of them genuinely wanted to build a life together. No consideration of whether they were prepared. The pregnancy had settled the question of their future. The bishop made the terms explicit. They would marry within the month, or Samuel would face permanent excommunication. Samuel agreed. Of course, he agreed. The price of refusal would have been the loss of his family, his land, his entire existence. So, a wedding was arranged. But it was not the wedding she had ever imagined for herself. Amish weddings are ordinarily enormous occasions. 300 guests, a full day of feasting, hours of singing. The whole community gathered to bless the couple beginning their life together. Her wedding had 40 people. There was no celebratory meal, no singing. The ceremony took place on a Tuesday morning in her parents' front room and was finished in under an hour. She wore a dark blue dress rather than the new wedding dress her mother would otherwise have sewn for her. There were no flowers. There was no joy. I stood in the back of that room and watched my closest friend marry a young man who had not freely chosen her, in front of a community that had not come to bless her, while carrying a child whose timing everyone in attendance was quietly calculating. She did not cry during the ceremony. She had spent so many weeks crying in the lead-up to it that I believe there was simply nothing left. The years that followed were harder than I can fully convey. She and Samuel moved into a small dotty house attached to his parents' farm. The baby arrived 7 months after the wedding, a healthy girl they named Anna. She loved that child with the full force of everything she had. But the marriage itself was a wound that never closed. Samuel was decent enough, but he was not in love with her, and she was not blind to it. He had been pressed into a life he had not selected, and he carried the quiet residue of that resentment for years. He was not unkind. He was simply not present. He put in long hours of work, ate his meals, slept in the same bed, and treated her more as an obligation than as a person he had chosen to spend his life with. The community treated her differently as well. Even after the ban was lifted and she was formally restored to fellowship, there was a mark on her that no amount of time or good behavior could remove. At quilting bees, a particular hush would fall when she came through the door. At church, certain families quietly steered their daughters away from sitting near her. Mothers used her name as a specific warning to their teenage girls. Don't become like her. She heard versions of that whispered behind her for the remainder of her years in the community. Her daughter Anna, an innocent child who had done nothing at all, grew up inheriting her mother's reputation. The arithmetic was never lost on anyone. Everyone could count. Everyone knew. I want you to understand something essential about what I am telling you. Her story is not an exception. Her story is the norm. The bishop's visit, the forced confession, the ban, the compelled marriage, the permanent social stain. This is not what happens to a handful of unlucky girls. This is standard procedure. Before I left, I knew at least 4 other young women in my district alone who went through some version of this identical process. Every one of them carried the same expression in their eyes afterward. An expression that said, "I made one mistake at 19, and it was allowed to determine everything that followed." But here is the part that no one discusses, the part that still surfaces in my mind late at night. There is another path, a darker one, that some Amish girls choose when the weight of the shame becomes unbearable. They leave before anyone finds out. They pack what they can carry. They walk out to the nearest road and accept a ride from an English driver and disappear into the outside world. They turn up at homeless shelters, at crisis pregnancy centers, at the homes of relatives who left the community years before. They abandon every single thing they have ever known because facing what is coming feels impossible. I knew one girl, Lydia, who did exactly this. She slipped away in the middle of the night with $70 tucked in her apron pocket. Her family told the community she had gone to stay with relatives in Ohio. She never returned. The last I heard, she was working as a waitress in Cleveland, raising her son by herself. Her parents have never laid eyes on their grandchild. After I left the community, I spent years in therapy slowly dismantling what I had witnessed and absorbed. My therapist asked me once why my friend's story had affected me as profoundly as it had, given that it had not directly happened to me. I sat with that question for a long time. What I eventually understood was that her story was the moment I first saw my world for what it actually was. Before her, I believed the community was fundamentally good. I believed the rules were just. I believed the bishop was wise. After her, I could not return to those beliefs. I had watched a 19-year-old girl be stripped of her future, her dignity, and her right to choose her own life, all in the service of preserving the community's appearance of purity. And I had watched the young man who had been equally responsible for what happened receive a fraction of the consequence, because in the world we inhabited, a man's mistake was always judged to be smaller than a woman's. I have spent years thinking about the theology behind all of this. The community would tell you the ban is an act of love, that the compelled marriage protects the child, that the lifelong reputation is simply the natural consequence of sin. They would reach for scripture about the wages of wrongdoing and the necessity of community discipline. I am not here to debate anyone's theology, but I will say this plainly. There is no version of love that requires a teenage girl to describe the most intimate details of her life to 3 men behind a closed door. There is no version of protection that locks 2 young people into a marriage neither of them selected and expects them to sustain it for 60 years. There is no version of grace that punishes a woman more severely than the man who was present for the same act. She is 41 years old now. She still lives in Lancaster County. She and Samuel had 4 more children after Anna. They are still married. From the outside, her life looks identical to the life of every other Amish woman around her. She cooks, tends her garden, attends church. But I saw her 3 years ago when I came back to the area for a funeral. We met quietly in a coffee shop because being seen with a shunned woman would have caused her serious problems. We talked for 2 hours, and just before she left, she reached across the table and took my hand and said something I have never stopped carrying. She said, "I love my children. I would not surrender them for anything in this world. But I need you to know something. The girl I was at 19, the one who walked into that room to face the bishop, she didn't walk back out. Whoever I am now, I am not her. I never got to discover who she would have become. Then she stood up and walked out. And I sat alone in that coffee shop and cried for an hour. If you grew up in a world where a single mistake at 19 was permitted to write the rest of your story, I see you. If you ever stood at the edge of a room and watched a friend get absorbed by a system that called itself love while it dismantled her, I see you. If you carry the weight of a community's judgment that was never proportionate to what you actually did, you are not alone. The system that consumed my friend was not built to rescue her. It was built to protect itself. And the price of that protection has always been extracted from young women who were given no tools with which to fight back. She did not get to choose her husband. She did not get to choose her wedding. She did not get to choose what her future looked like. But she did get to choose what she said to me across that table, and in saying it, she chose to ensure her story would not remain buried. So I am saying it now, because she would want me to. Because somewhere out there, right now, there is a young Amish girl who is 3 weeks late and terrified, and standing in the dark of a barn at midnight trying to understand what is coming for her. She deserves to know the truth of what that is. It is not love. It is not justice. It is not God. It is a system. And systems can be named. Systems can be questioned. Systems can be left behind. Systems can be survived. If this story reached something inside you, leave it in the comments. Tell me what stayed with you. And remember this as you carry it forward. What was done to her was not fate. It was a choice the community made, over and over, long before she was born. And the fact that it was repeated for generations does not make it right. It only makes it older.